Fire! 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 The frantic cries echoed down the quiet suburban street of Bremerton, Washington, cutting through the calm of a sleepy summer evening. The neighbors, already rushing toward the smoke, could hardly believe their eyes. The Hatcheney household, a charming two-story home, was engulfed in flames. Thick black smoke swirled into the sky, rising like an ominous warning to the world. "Call 911, someone shouted. Within moments, the distant sound of sirens wailed, their red and blue lights flashing against the twilight. Help was on the way. But would it be enough? Would anyone survive? What if everything you thought you knew about someone was a lie? Could you ever forgive the person you loved most if their darkest secret shattered the very foundation of your trust? What if that secret led to something unimaginable? A loss so great that no one could ever truly heal from it. Before we delve deeper into this web of intrigue, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell if you want us to keep bringing you stories you won't find on Google. Now, let's crack this case wide open. Nick Hatcheney stood in the center of his small office at Christ Community Church, flipping through the worn pages of his Bible. His fingers ran over the soft, crinkled edges of the pages, the familiar smell of ink and paper grounding him in a moment of stillness before the storm. He could feel the weight of the evening ahead, an event he had long dreaded. Tonight, everything would change. His life, his marriage, his faith. All of it teetered on the edge of a cliff. Nick hadn't realized how much pressure he had been under until the weight of the impending conversation with Dawn pressed in on him. For the last several weeks, he'd felt the walls closing in on him. The questions, the suspicions, the nagging feeling in the back of his mind that something wasn't quite right. But for now, everything appeared perfect. He leaned back in his creaky office chair, staring at the small wooden desk cluttered with papers, a half-empty coffee mug, and his Bible. The Bible was always nearby, a constant companion in his work. As the pastor of Christ Community Church, Nick was supposed to be a rock, steadfast in his faith, a leader for his congregation, someone who could provide solace in troubled times. But tonight, he knew, he would be the one seeking answers. His life had once felt like a carefully crafted portrait. Nick and Dawn had been married for 12 years, and in that time they had built a life full of love, faith, and 3 beautiful children. Their family, on the surface, was perfect. They were everything people looked to and admired. The couple everyone thought had it all together. Nick's mind wandered to the first time he saw Dawn. He remembered how she had walked into church one Sunday, her golden hair glowing in the sunlight streaming through the windows. There was something about the way she moved, the way her eyes sparkled with warmth and kindness, that had drawn him in immediately. At the time, Nick had just finished a lengthy sermon on faith and trust, but it wasn't until he met her that he truly understood what it meant to trust, to love, and to be loved in return. Their early years together were filled with shared dreams, quiet evenings spent reading scripture, and laughter echoing through their home. Dawn had always been patient, kind, and full of life. Qualities that Nick had admired and relied upon. She was the calming presence he needed in the whirlwind of his ministry, someone who made their house feel like a sanctuary. Their children had come a few years after their marriage, 2 boys, Mark and David, followed by their daughter, Emily. Nick had always imagined his family would look like this, the perfect blend of love and faith. The Hatcheney household had become a place where laughter resonated through the walls, where stories from the Bible were read at bedtime, and where the sound of prayer filled the space every evening. But somewhere in the back of Nick's mind there had always been a question. He had never said it aloud, but the question had lingered there like an uninvited guest. Why had Dawn never been able to conceive naturally? The thought had crossed Nick's mind many times, usually during the quiet moments when he found himself alone with his thoughts. There were the late-night conversations about their attempts to have a fourth child, the gentle promises to try again next year, the shared glances of hope and disappointment when things didn't work out. Don had always seemed so at peace with the process. He would smile and tell him that God's plan would unfold in its own time, that they would be blessed when the time was right. They'd tried for years to have children of their own. At first, it seemed like the natural course. Nick was sure they would be able to expand their family. After all, they had been blessed with 3 children already. But as the months turned into years and the pregnancy tests continued to come back negative, Nick's thoughts began to shift. There were whispers of infertility in the back of his mind, but Dawn had always pushed them aside with her quiet optimism. He trusted her, of course. He had no reason not to. They had built their marriage on faith, on communication, and on the belief that nothing was beyond God's will. After several failed attempts, they had turned to fertility treatments. Nick remembered the first time they had visited the fertility specialist. It was a cold, clinical office with sterile white walls and rows of pamphlets about various treatments. The doctor had been kind but matter-of-fact, outlining their options without much emotional consideration. The procedure sounded simple enough, but Nick could sense the weight of it hanging over them. The doctor explained that Dawn's fertility could be enhanced with medical intervention, and they had discussed a plan of action that would hopefully result in a successful pregnancy. The news had been a relief, but it had also felt like a burden, an unspoken acknowledgement that something wasn't quite right. Still, Dawn had taken the lead, arranging the appointments and following through with the treatment plan. It wasn't until later, after their 3rd child was born, that Nick had begun to sense something wasn't adding up. The treatments had worked. Their daughter Emily had come into their lives after a long wait. It should have been a joyous occasion, but Nick found himself lingering on certain details, questions that had never quite been answered. Why hadn't they discussed the specifics of the treatments? And why had they not given her a threesome before they married an ordinary family? Why did Dawn always seem so reluctant to talk about the procedures? Nick had asked a few times, of course, but Dawn always brushed it off with a smile and a gentle, "We don't need to worry about that. We have our children now." And so he had accepted it. He had accepted her word, trusted her. After all, she was the woman he loved, the woman who had shared his life for over a decade. And at the time, her explanations had been enough. At least, he thought they were. But as the years went on, Nick found himself confronting a growing unease. He began to notice small things that didn't quite add up, the occasional awkwardness when friends would ask about their fertility journey, the sudden tension when someone would casually mention the difficulty of having children. The nagging doubts began to rear their heads, slowly at first, like whispers in the dark. Something wasn't right. There was a secret, Nick was certain of it. Something Dawn had kept from him. The doubts had eaten at him in the quiet moments, and in the rush of his work and church responsibilities, they were always there, just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to rise to the top. It wasn't until Dawn's sudden health issues began to surface, with complaints of fatigue and cramps, that Nick finally felt compelled to ask the question he had been avoiding for years. But he wasn't prepared for the answer. The truth, when it finally came, was more than Nick could have ever imagined. What would you do if your whole life was built on a lie? Would you stand by the person you loved, or would the truth tear everything apart? Could the woman who had shared your life for over a decade truly be hiding something as monumental as this? The questions in Nick's mind now seemed endless, and soon there would be no avoiding them. The evening of revelation was approaching, and Nick would soon face the hardest decision of his life. It was on an ordinary Tuesday that Nick learned the truth. The weather outside was typical for a late fall afternoon in Bremerton. Cool, gray, with the threat of rain hanging in the air. The usual buzz of everyday life seemed to carry on, Yet Nick could feel an unsettling shift in the atmosphere at home. Something was wrong. Dawn had been feeling unwell for weeks now. Unexplained fatigue, strange cramps that never seemed to go away, and an overwhelming sense of dread that clung to the air like fog. Nick had noticed it. He was no stranger to these kinds of subtle changes. After all, he had spent years as a pastor, listening to people share their burdens, their physical and emotional struggles. But this felt different. It wasn't just the typical exhaustion that came with juggling the demands of work and family life. This was something deeper, something more persistent. Dawn wasn't herself. She was quieter than usual, even at the dinner table, where their children, Mark, David, and Emily, chattered about their school day, oblivious to the unspoken tension between their parents. Nick tried to engage her, but the distance between them had grown. She smiled and nodded, but it was the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. It was as if her mind was elsewhere, and it made Nick uneasy. Finally, after weeks of watching his wife struggle, Nick insisted they go see a doctor. At first, Dawn hesitated. She was the type of person who tried to carry the weight of everything on her own shoulders, who didn't like to admit when something was wrong. But there was a look in Nick's eyes, one of genuine concern, that made her relent. "Okay, fine," she had said, sighing as she put down her knitting. "But just a checkup. I'm sure it's nothing." Nick didn't argue. He simply agreed and scheduled an appointment for the following morning. The sterile, fluorescent-lit atmosphere of the doctor's office felt oppressive as they sat in the waiting room. Dawn was quiet, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap, and Nick tried to read the old magazines on the coffee table, but nothing could distract him from the knot tightening in his stomach. He knew something was off. He could feel it. When their name was finally called, they followed the nurse down the narrow hallway into an examination room. The doctor, a tall, middle-aged man with glasses perched on the bridge of his nose, greeted them with a smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Good morning, Mr. and Mrs. Hatchain," he said. "What brings you in today?" Nick took a deep breath and spoke for Dawn. "She's been feeling pretty run down lately. She's having cramps and just generally not feeling herself. We thought it might be something we should get checked out." The doctor nodded, motioning for Dawn to lie on the examination table. He performed the usual tests, his hands moving with practiced ease, and Nick sat at her side, watching the process with growing anxiety. He noticed Dawn's discomfort but said nothing, unsure if it was due to the medical exam or something deeper. Finally, after several minutes, the doctor stepped back, adjusting his glasses and making a few notes on a clipboard. "I'm afraid I have some news," he began, and Nick's heart skipped a beat. Nick looked at Dawn, her face pale, as if she had already anticipated what the doctor was about to say. "Mr. Hackney, I'm afraid your wife has a condition, one that's quite rare," the doctor continued. "Dawn doesn't have a womb." Nick's world stopped. The air seemed to drain from the room as the doctor's words hung in the silence. He blinked, unable to process what he had just heard. The room began to spin slightly, and he had to grip the edge of the table to steady himself. His mind raced in a frantic whirlwind of confusion, disbelief, and an all-consuming need for clarity. How is that possible? Nick's voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. But we have children. 3 children. The doctor took a seat across from them, his expression sympathetic. He nodded slowly as though he had delivered this kind of news before. "Yes, it's possible. Dawn was born without a uterus, a medical anomaly. It's very rare, but it does happen. What I think happened, based on her medical history and the treatment she has undergone, is that she used a combination of donor sperm and in vitro fertilization, IVF, to conceive your children. The procedures took place before your marriage." Nick's mind couldn't keep up. The words didn't make sense, yet they were piercing him, each sentence a shard of glass that cut deeper than the last. Dawn, his wife, the woman who had shared his life for over a decade, the mother of his children, had been hiding this from him. All those years, all those moments when they had talked about their family, about the future, about their children. She had kept this secret. And why? His eyes locked on Dawn's, but she didn't meet his gaze. Instead, she stared down at her hands, her fingers trembling ever so slightly. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The silence between them spoke volumes. "Why didn't you tell me?" Nick finally managed to ask, his voice thick with disbelief. Dawn's lips parted as if she were about to speak, but no words came. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with sadness, regret, and something else, a kind of fear. She seemed to be searching for the right words, but they escaped her. "I didn't know how to tell you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't want to hurt you. I thought it was better this way. I thought you would still love me, even without knowing. I was afraid that if you knew, you wouldn't want to be with me anymore." Nick's thoughts swirled. The weight of the revelation was too much. How had he not known? How had he been so blind? It was like his whole life had been a carefully constructed house of cards, and now, with a single gust of wind, it had all come crashing down. But there was another thought that gnawed at him, something darker that clawed at his mind. The children. How had they come into the world? Were they his? Had they been his all along? Or had she lied about everything? About their love, about their future, about their family? Nick turned his gaze back to the doctor, trying to ground himself in the facts. "So the children, they're biologically hers?" The doctor nodded. "Yes. The children are Dawn's biologically, but the process was assisted. It was a donor sperm situation, and I believe the IVF procedure was done prior to your marriage. I'm not sure of the details, but from the information I've gathered, it seems she didn't want you to know the truth because she feared it would change everything." Nick's heart ached as his eyes wandered back to Dawn, who still refused to meet his gaze. The silence was deafening. The weight of the secret she had carried for so long was suddenly too much to bear, and now, with the truth exposed, everything felt like it was slipping through his fingers. His marriage, his trust, his sense of self. But there was still more. The cracks had begun to show, and now the question that had been gnawing at Nick's gut for years, why, was growing louder. Why had she kept this from him? What had motivated her to deceive him so completely? The love they had shared, the family they had built, was it all a lie? And more importantly, could he ever forgive her? That evening, after the doctor's visit, everything seemed off. The world around Nick felt strangely muted, as though he were living in a fog. The simple act of going through the motions of daily life seemed impossible now, each action weighed down by the unrelenting knowledge of what he had just learned. The conversation in the doctor's office, the cold, sterile walls, the words that had cut him like a knife. They all echoed in his mind. Nick tried to distract himself with the usual household chores, checking his sermon notes, organizing some papers for Sunday's service, scrawling through emails. But none of it held his attention. Every thought kept returning to one singular question. Why had she kept this secret from him? He tried to push it away, to focus on anything else, but the knowledge festered like an open wound that refused to heal. The room felt suffocating as the evening wore on. His thoughts swirled in chaos, each one more overwhelming than the last. What else had she lied about? How deep did this deception run? His stomach churned at the idea that perhaps their entire life together had been built on half-truths and omissions. The thought that the woman he had trusted, the woman he had built a family with, could have concealed something so fundamental. It felt like a betrayal of the deepest kind. It was hard to breathe, hard to think, as the clock ticked on. Dawn had taken the children to bed, as she always did, reading them their bedtime stories with the same calm assurance that had made her such a beloved figure in their household. She seemed so perfect, so unshakable. How had she hidden this from him for so long? Nick knew he couldn't avoid this any longer. He had to confront her. He couldn't let the silence between them grow any deeper. He had to know the truth. All of it. As the house grew quieter, Nick's heart pounded louder in his chest. The silence seemed to stretch on, thick and unbearable, as he waited for Dawn to come upstairs. He didn't know how he was going to approach this, didn't know if he even had the words to express the storm inside him. But the questions wouldn't stop. Dawn, his wife, the woman he had given his heart to. Had she been lying to him all these years? Did he truly know her? And if not, then who was she, really? He could hear her soft footsteps in the hall, her familiar rhythm as she approached their bedroom. When the door creaked open, Nick didn't even look up. He was sitting on the edge of their bed, his head lowered, staring at the floor, trying to gather his thoughts. The moment she stepped inside, the air between them shifted. There was an almost electric charge now, a tension that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just the lingering question in the air. It was the way Dawn was standing there, her eyes flicking toward him. "Nick," she said softly, her voice small, trembling. "You're scaring me." Nick finally raised his eyes, his gaze meeting hers. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with concern. He saw the way she fidgeted with the hem of her shirt, the way her fingers twisted and turned nervously in the air. She was anxious, just as much as he was, but for entirely different reasons. She had been waiting for it, possibly for years. He felt the weight of his own hurt, the betrayal sinking deeper with every second that passed. The storm inside him broke free, spilling over into his words. "Dawn," he began, his voice hoarse. "Why didn't you tell me? All these years. How could you hide something like this from me?" His voice cracked, the pain of the question radiating from his chest. "We've been together for so long. We've had children together. And now I'm learning that all of this, everything, was built on a lie?" Dawn's breath hitched, and her face crumpled as the weight of his words struck her. She stood there, shaking, as though she hadn't prepared for this kind of confrontation. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't wipe them away. She didn't make any move to comfort him. Perhaps because she knew she was the one who had caused this pain. "I never wanted you to know," she whispered, her voice breaking. She stepped toward him, but Nick stayed rooted to the spot, unwilling to be comforted, unwilling to let this moment slip by unexamined. "I thought it was the only way we could have children. I thought you would leave me if you knew. I thought if you knew, you'd look at me differently. I couldn't bear that." Nick's heart wrenched as her words pierced through him. The room was thick with silence, and he could feel the weight of every unspoken word hanging between them. It wasn't just about the secret she had kept. It was about the years they had spent together, believing in something that now seemed so fragile, so easily broken. "I never wanted to hurt you," she continued, her voice quieter now. "I thought I was protecting us. I thought that if we had a family, if we had our children, that everything would be okay. That you'd love me and we'd be okay." Nick's mind spun. He wanted to scream, to shout, to demand answers to every question that burned in his chest, but instead he felt a cold kind of numbness wash over him as if he were standing outside of his own body, watching it all unfold from a distance. His chest tightened, and he struggled to breathe as the truth sank in deeper. The life he thought he knew, his perfect family, his perfect marriage, had been built on something incomplete. Trust, love, faith. It all felt so fragile now, like a house of cards that could topple with the slightest touch. "I trusted you," Nick said softly, his voice barely a whisper. He shook his head, unable to look at her. "I believed in you, Dawn. I believed in everything we had. And now, I don't know what to believe anymore." Dawn's hands shook as she reached for him, but Nick recoiled instinctively. He couldn't let her touch him, not yet. Not until he understood everything. "What else, Dawn?" Nick's voice was filled with quiet desperation now. "What else have you kept from me? What else have you lied about? If you could hide this, what else is there? What else have you kept in the dark?" The words hung in the air, bitter and raw. Nick could feel the truth beginning to unravel, layer by layer, each revelation stripping away his sense of security. The world he had known seemed to be crumbling before him, and the deeper he dug, the more questions arose. Dawn's expression twisted with pain, and for the first time Nick saw the depth of her regret. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words seemed to catch in her throat. How could she explain this? How could she make him understand? "I didn't know how to tell you," she whispered, her voice fragile, almost pleading. "I thought if I told you, you'd leave me. I couldn't lose you. I couldn't lose this family. Please, Nick, please, understand. I did it because I thought it was the only way. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought if we had children, we would be like any other family." Nick's eyes searched her face, trying to find the woman he had married, the woman he had loved so deeply. But now, she seemed like a stranger. The woman he had known and loved for all these years felt like a shadow of someone else, a person he could no longer recognize. His heart broke all over again. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just heartbreak. It was confusion, betrayal, and anger. How had it come to this? How could the woman he had trusted more than anyone else in the world have kept this from him? How could they have built a life together, a family? The room grew colder as the silence stretched on between them. Dawn stood motionless, her face pale, her eyes wet with tears. She waited, almost as if she were afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid to do anything that might push him further away. Finally, Nick spoke, his voice heavy with the weight of his disbelief. "I don't know who you are anymore." The words stung both of them, and Dawn's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to reach out, to explain, to somehow make him understand. But the damage had already been done. The secrets had already been laid bare. Could they ever come back from this? Could their marriage survive when it had been built on a lie so deep, so fundamental? And if it couldn't, what would that mean for the family they had built together? Nick's mind was spinning, the questions endlessly circling. But one thing was clear. Nothing would ever be the same again. Would you ever be able to look at someone the same way after learning a truth so painful? How deep do lies have to go before trust can never be restored? And what happens when the very foundation of your life crumbles, leaving you standing in the rubble, wondering who you really are and who you're supposed to become? The days that followed the revelation were long and unbearable. The weight of the truth hung in the air like a dense fog, suffocating everything around Nick. The simple act of getting out of bed each morning felt impossible. His mind was a battleground, torn between the person he had always known and loved and the person standing before him now. A woman who had concealed something so fundamental to their life together, something that changed Everything. Nick couldn't stop questioning everything. How long had she known? How far back did this lie go? Was our entire life together a fake? These thoughts consumed him day and night, eating away at his ability to focus on anything else. He became obsessed with the questions. At times they felt like a constant drone in the back of his mind, never letting him escape the sound of his own disbelief. Every glance at Dawn felt like an accusation, a reminder of the secret she had kept, the truth she had hidden from him. But the children, they were the source of his deepest turmoil. How had they conceived them? Were they even truly his? Was this whole family built on deception too? Every time he looked at their 3 beautiful children, their faces filled with innocent trust, his heart ached. What if they weren't mine? What if they were just part of the lie? He would hold them in his arms, pretending that everything was fine. But inside, his mind spiraled, his thoughts tangled in knots. Dawn begged him for forgiveness, speaking with the sincerity of someone who truly regretted the deception. She cried often, her voice breaking as she apologized over and over again. "I never wanted to hurt you, Nick. I was scared," she would say, as if those words could undo everything. But it was no use. The anger that burned inside him seemed to be growing, fed by each tear she shed. It wasn't her sorrow he needed. It was the truth. But the truth felt so fractured now, so incomplete. How could he trust her again? The anger inside Nick was overwhelming. Every time he looked at her, the secret was there, lurking in the shadows of their relationship. He could see it in the way she avoided his eyes, in the way her hands trembled when she spoke, in the way her voice would crack when she begged for forgiveness. But forgiveness seemed impossible. How could he ever forgive her for something so monumental, something that had so thoroughly shaken the very foundation of their life together? Nick spent most of his days in a haze of frustration. He would go through the motions, teaching his sermons, speaking to the congregation, smiling and nodding as if everything was okay, but it wasn't, not even close. The more time passed, the more he began to unravel. The man who had stood at the pulpit, preaching about love, faith, and trust, was now a shadow of himself. Each passing day was like a slow descent into madness, as if everything he had believed in was falling apart. Dawn did her best to stay close, to comfort him, but Nick pushed her away. It wasn't just the lie that had broken him, it was the fact that she had kept it from him for so long. He didn't know who she was anymore. He didn't know if he could ever look at her the same way again. And then there were the children. They were the one thing that kept him from spiraling completely. Every time he felt like he couldn't breathe, he would look at their faces, and for a brief moment, a sense of purpose would return. They were innocent, untouched by the chaos that was consuming their parents. But that too was complicated. He wasn't sure how to talk to them. He wasn't sure how to face them. How could he look them in the eye knowing that their mother, his wife, had lied about something so crucial, something that had shaped their entire family dynamic? And all the while the guilt gnawed at him. What if, in his search for answers, he was destroying everything? What if his anger was clouding his judgment? What if the truth was more complicated than he could even begin to understand? One night, after an especially heated argument, Nick's patience finally snapped. The storm inside him had been building for so long, and he couldn't hold it in any longer. It felt as though the walls were closing in on him, as if he were suffocating in the very life he had once known. He had tried to talk to Dawn. He had tried to reason with her, to understand why she had kept this secret, why she had lied. But the more they spoke, the more questions piled up, the more answers were left unspoken. It was too much. His mind was fractured, no longer able to hold the weight of the confusion and hurt. "How could you do this to me?" Nick shouted, his voice raw with emotion. His hands were shaking, clenched into fists at his sides. His chest felt tight, as though his heart was physically breaking in two. The words spilled out of him like a dam breaking, uncontrollable and wild. "We've built everything on this lie, Dawn." Dawn flinched, her face paling as she stepped back instinctively, her hands raised as though trying to shield herself from the storm. She hadn't seen Nick like this before. She had seen his frustration, his sadness, his pain, but this was different. This was pure rage, and it terrified her. "Nick, please, just listen," she begged, her voice trembling. Her eyes were wide with fear and regret, but Nick wasn't listening anymore. He had crossed the point of no return. He couldn't hear her through the overwhelming surge of anger that had consumed him. His emotions overtook him. His fear, his confusion, his pain, all mixed together in a storm of rage. The intensity of it was all-consuming. Nick felt his blood rush to his head, his vision narrowing. He needed an outlet. He needed to do something, anything, to release the pressure that was building inside him. Without thinking, he turned and stormed out of the room. His mind was racing, his heart pounding, his hands were shaking with adrenaline. He didn't know what he was doing, didn't know why he was doing it, but the fire, the heat, the anger, it all seemed to melt together in his mind. He needed to burn something. He needed to destroy something. He stormed into the garage, slamming the door behind him. The cold air hit his face, but it did nothing to cool the heat in his chest. His eyes darted around the cluttered space, the shelves of tools, the piles of old boxes. Then his eyes landed on a bottle of rubbing alcohol. A small, clear plastic bottle that sat on a shelf near the workbench. His hands were trembling as he reached for it. The matches were nearby, tucked away in a drawer, and his fingers moved mechanically to grab them. He didn't even register what he was doing until his hands were holding both the alcohol and the matches. The fire, the heat, it was all starting to make sense now. He could feel the rage burning in his chest, the need to make something happen, to destroy something, anything, before he completely lost himself. In his mind, everything was connected. The anger, the fear, the betrayal, it was all one. The secret she had kept, the lies she had told, it had burned him. And now, he was going to burn something too. He unscrewed the cap, pouring the alcohol over a pile of old papers in the corner of the garage. The smell of the liquid was sharp and overpowering, filling the small space with its acrid scent. He lit the match with trembling fingers and, without thinking, tossed it onto the pile of papers. The fire leapt up, fast and furious, consuming the papers in a flash of orange. The flames crackled, hissing as they devoured the fuel. The heat from the fire burned his face, but it didn't matter. The anger inside him, the rage, it felt good. It felt like control, like he was taking something back, like he was finally able to release the emotions that had been suffocating him for days, for weeks. But as the fire blazed in front of him, Nick's heart began to race. The heat wasn't just coming from the fire, it was coming from within him. He felt his chest tighten again, the familiar knot of guilt and confusion beginning to form. What had he just done? Could Nick ever come back from this? Was the damage beyond repair? In his quest for control, had he lost the one thing that had ever truly mattered to him? The fire burned on, but now it was no longer just a physical blaze. It was a reflection of the turmoil inside him. Fury and regret, both battling for dominance. The question was, could he find his way back to himself before the fire consumed everything? The garage had been the first outlet, the first attempt to break free from the unbearable pressure, the burning rage inside him. But when Nick returned to the bedroom, his emotions had not subsided. If anything, the fire in his chest had only grown fiercer, the heat from the garage still alive in his veins. There was no turning back. The damage was already done. And the dark thoughts swirled faster and more fiercely than ever before. Dawn was sitting on the edge of their bed, her back turned toward the door when Nick entered. She was trembling. Her body was stiff, her hands clasped together in her lap, and her face was pale. The exhaustion and grief from their earlier conversation still etched into her features. She didn't even look up when he walked in, but she must have heard him, for she tensed the moment his shadow fell across the doorway. For a long moment there was only silence, the kind of silence that feels like it's stretching, like the walls are closing in, and your heart is pounding too loud for your body to keep up. Dawn slowly turned to face him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and uncertainty. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words never came. Her lips trembled as though she was searching for the right thing to say, but there was no right thing left. Nothing could undo what had happened. Nothing could erase the betrayal that had already been put into motion. Nick didn't speak either. He couldn't. There were no words that could carry the weight of what he was feeling, no words that could repair the rift in his chest. The anger was still there, sharp and jagged, but now it was laced with something else, something deeper, something that twisted in his gut like a dagger. It was regret, sure. It was guilt. But there was something darker, something he couldn't even name, that gripped him harder than any of those emotions, and it was suffocating him. His hands were shaking as he stood there, still holding the bottle of rubbing alcohol. The liquid inside sloshed against the sides, the plastic crinkling under the pressure of his grip. The sound of it was unnerving in the quiet room, and yet it was all Nick could hear. The weight of the bottle in his hands was heavy, almost as if it had a mind of its own. He didn't want to do it. He didn't want to hurt her. But the anger wouldn't stop. It kept pushing, kept clawing at him, demanding he act, demanding he make the pain go away. And for a moment his mind went blank. Without warning, Nick splashed the alcohol onto the bed. His hands were unsteady, but there was a precision to the movement. It was deliberate. As the liquid spread across the comforter and soaked into the fabric, Dawn's eyes widened in horror. She stood up quickly, her hands trembling in front of her as if trying to protect herself. Protect everything that had been built. "No, Nick, please," she begged, her voice filled with panic, but it was too late. The alcohol caught fire almost instantly, the flames leaping up in an explosive burst of orange. The fire was ferocious, and the bed, her sanctuary, their shared space, was engulfed in flames, crackling and twisting, as if it had come alive. Dawn gasped in terror, her hands rising in front of her instinctively, as though to shield herself from the flames that seemed to grow larger with every passing second. She stumbled back, her breath coming in sharp, panicked bursts. Her eyes locked onto Nick's, but what she saw in his expression only drove the fear deeper. There was no remorse in his eyes, not yet. There was only the rawness of the emotion that had driven him here, and the horror of the realization of what he had done. "Nick, please, stop. I'm sorry. Please don't do this," she cried, her voice choking on desperation. Nick didn't answer. He couldn't. His legs felt weak beneath him as he watched the fire spread. The smoke began to fill the room, rising up in thick black clouds, obscuring their vision, suffocating the air. It felt like the entire world had shrunk down to this single room. The heat, the fire, the regret, all of it closing in on him. Dawn screamed, trying to move toward the door, but the flames were too fast, too furious. The bed, the nightstand, the curtains, they were all burning now, and there was no escape. She backed away from the inferno that was consuming her, but with each step the flames seemed to leap higher, as if they were reaching for her, following her every movement. She stumbled, and for a brief, horrifying moment, she was caught in the blaze. They had caught her after all. The pain on her face was indescribable. But what hurt Nick more than anything was that he couldn't do anything. He was paralyzed by the weight of his actions, paralyzed by the enormity of the fire he had set, both literally and metaphorically. He couldn't even move as he watched her struggle, her breathing shallow, her skin reddening from the heat. Dawn turned toward him, tears streaking down her face as she gasped for breath. "Nick, please," she whispered, her voice breaking. But the fire was louder now, drowning out everything else, the desperation in her voice, the cry for mercy. It was drowned by the roar of the flames, their crackling and hissing as they continued their assault. Nick's heart pounded in his chest, but it wasn't the fear of her death that gripped him. It was the realization of what he had done, the understanding that this fire, this rage, was a reflection of everything that had been broken between them. He had been so consumed by the lie, by the feeling of betrayal, that he had forgotten who he was. He had forgotten that this moment, was the very thing he had been terrified of becoming, a monster, but it was too late for remorse now. Dawn's movements grew slower, weaker. The smoke had filled the room, thick and choking, and she was losing her strength. Her vision was blurry, her chest tightening as she gasped for air. She tried to crawl toward the door, but the heat was too much. She was caught. The fire was closing in on her, swallowing her up. The last thing Nick could hear was her strangled breath, her quiet sobbing, and the unmistakable sound of her body collapsing onto the burning floor. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. It was like his entire world was collapsing in on him. The sound of sirens reached his ears, faint at first but growing louder, coming closer. The fire department was on their way, but Nick knew in that moment that it was too late. The damage had been done. He had done it. There was no turning back. He could already see the smoke rising, curling around the corners of the room, choking the life out of everything. He dropped to his knees, his hands falling limp at his sides as he stared at the fire, the woman he had once loved reduced to nothing more than a silhouette in the blaze. There was no more running, no more pretending. He had lost everything. The sound of sirens grew louder, and soon the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the windows. The fire department was outside trying to break through the chaos, but none of it mattered. Nick knew that by the time they arrived, it would be over. The woman he had loved for over a decade, the mother of his children, the person who had shared every part of his life with him, was gone. He had killed her, and no matter what happened next, he would never be able to escape that truth. What had happened? How had it all come to this? Could anyone, even Nick himself, fully understand the transformation that had taken place in him? In his quest for truth, in his desperate need for answers, he had lost everything. Could there be redemption after this? Or was this the end of everything? The end of his marriage, his family, his own humanity? And how would his children ever live with the legacy of this night? And yet, if anything, this legacy had increased. Would they ever forgive him? Would he ever forgive himself? The investigation into Dawn's death was swift, as it usually was in cases where the fire was not just an accident, but an act of intentional destruction. Firefighters had arrived to find the house nearly destroyed. The inferno had left little behind except ashes, a few pieces of charred furniture, and a lingering stench of burned wood and regret. But what they found inside was far more disturbing. Hundreds and hundreds of books, then buried by static, then on insight. 6 and 7 years before, the house had been found in ashes and burned to ash. Neighbors had reported seeing Nick in a frantic state earlier that evening. One neighbor described him pacing outside their house, shouting at someone over the phone, and then running into the garage. Others said they saw him coming in and out of the house, seemingly unaware of the smoke billowing from the windows. There were also strange moments when Nick would freeze and look at the burning house, as if in disbelief, his face a mask of fear and guilt. The neighbors whispered behind closed doors, their voices full of speculation and disbelief. The perfect preacher, the leader of the church, had snapped. As law enforcement began questioning him, Nick's behavior did little to help his case. At first, he was in shock, unable to comprehend what had just happened. He spoke in halting phrases, stumbling over his words, trying to make sense of the night's events. But as the hours dragged on, his story began to fall apart. He seemed unable to explain certain details, his recollection of events disjointed, his answers contradicting themselves. Nick's emotional outbursts during the questioning, his tears, his anger, his inability to explain his actions, were troubling. The more they asked, the more they realized something wasn't right. Nick had lost control, and it was clear he hadn't been the man he once was in those final moments. It didn't take long for the police to piece together the evidence and discover the truth. They found traces of rubbing alcohol near the bed, a bottle discarded in the corner of the room, and enough physical evidence to connect Nick directly to the arson and the murder. His fingerprints were found all over the bottle of alcohol, and the flames had started in a pattern that indicated it was no accident. The trajectory of the fire matched the spread of the alcohol. Nick had set the bed ablaze with the intention of killing Dawn. The emotional fury that had consumed him in that final moment was not just a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a deliberate act, fueled by rage and something far more sinister. Nick was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, arson, and manslaughter. The details of the crime came to light in a courtroom that was packed with spectators, family, and members of the church who had once revered him. Gasps filled the room when the prosecution laid out the sequence of events. How Nick had been overcome by a toxic combination of anger, fear, and betrayal. The realization that Dawn had kept such a profound secret from him, one that shattered his understanding of their life together, had driven him to a place of madness. But what shocked everyone more than the crime itself was the truth about the Hatcheny family. Beneath the facade of their perfect life, there had always been cracks, hidden lies, and omissions. Dawn had kept secrets from Nick, yes. But in the end, it was Nick's own actions, his inability to control his anger, his inability to process the betrayal, that destroyed everything. The beautiful life they had built together, their family of 3 children, a strong church marriage, it had all been built on a web of lies, omissions, and deception. Dawn's choice to keep her infertility a secret, Nick's blind faith in their perfect life, and the emotional violence that had simmered beneath the surface. It had all come to this catastrophic end. The media frenzy surrounding the trial was like nothing the small town of Bremerton had ever seen. Headlines screamed with words like "Pastor gone mad," "Preacher kills wife in fit of rage," and "The dark side of a perfect family." The story captivated the nation, drawing people in with its disturbing blend of love, betrayal, and violence. The Hatcheny family's image, once held up as a beacon of faith and family values, had been shattered, and the public's fascination with the case grew, fueled by the knowledge that the truth about the Hatchenys wasn't as clean as it had once appeared. Nick's behavior in the courtroom only deepened the horror. He sat quietly, his eyes hollow, his face pale and drawn. His once commanding presence as a preacher was gone. He seemed small now, a man utterly lost in his own actions. He couldn't bear to look at Dawn's family, who sat in the front row, their faces filled with grief and disbelief. How could they ever forgive him for what he had done, for taking away the woman they had loved so dearly? The children, too, were affected. They were placed in the care of extended family, the church community rallying around them, but the emotional toll of the crime was immense. Mark, David, and Emily, who were now orphaned by their father's violence, were too young to fully understand what had happened, but they felt the absence of both their parents. The void left by Dawn's death was impossible to fill, and the knowledge that their father had been responsible for her death haunted them, even at such a tender age. Would they ever understand the depth of the pain that had led to this? Would they ever heal from the devastation that had torn their family apart? Nick was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. His once promising career as a pastor, his image as a loving husband and father, were completely destroyed. There was no redemption in sight for him. The church that had once supported him turned its back on him, unable to reconcile the man they had once admired with the monster who had committed such an unspeakable act. As he was escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs, Nick's mind was consumed by regret. He had destroyed everything he had ever cared about: his marriage, his family, his faith. And now he was going to spend the rest of his life behind bars, haunted by the woman he had once loved and the children who would never understand how everything had gone so horribly wrong. The town of Bremerton would never be the same after that night. The perfect preacher and his beautiful wife, their story, which had once been one of faith and love, had been replaced by one of betrayal, violence, and tragedy. In the years that followed, the children grew older, carrying the weight of their family's legacy with them. Mark, the oldest, had a hard time reconciling his memories of his father with the monstrous reality of what Nick had done. He struggled with his anger, his confusion, and his deep sense of loss. He became determined to live a life that was nothing like the one his father had led, and although he was young, he began to understand the importance of honesty and transparency in his own relationships. David and Emily, still so young at the time of the crime, grew up in a different world. They would never know the love and support of their mother, and their memories of their father were clouded by his betrayal. They often visited Nick in prison, their emotions conflicted. Part of them wanted to hate him, to never forgive him for what he had done, but another part of them longed to understand. Why had he done it? Why had he thrown it all away? And Nick lived out the rest of his days behind bars, his soul haunted by the woman he had killed and the children he had destroyed. He spent his time in solitary confinement, unable to find solace in anything. He had once stood at the pulpit, preaching about faith and redemption, but now he had nothing. He was left to grapple with the reality of what he had become. The man who had burned everything down, including the family he had once loved. As time passed, the Hatchinee case became a grim reminder of the dangers of secrets kept too long, of the darkness that can fester beneath the surface of even the most perfect lives. It was a story that no one would ever forget, a cautionary tale of how trust can be shattered, and how the consequences of betrayal can reverberate through a family for generations. And for Nick, there was no redemption. Only the long, lonely years in prison, spent in quiet torment, haunted by the face of the woman he had once loved, and the children who would never understand the man he had been before the flames consumed him. But how many secrets can we truly keep? When does a lie become something too big to hide, no matter the intentions behind it? Could Dawn's love and devotion to Nick have made her actions justifiable? Or was Nick right to feel betrayed by the woman he thought he knew? Could the truth about their past, her hidden infertility, his growing suspicions, be enough to justify the actions that led to such an unimaginable end? Was it the betrayal, the secret kept in the name of love, that drove Nick to the breaking point? Or was it something deeper within him? An inability to cope with the imperfections in the life he thought he had? And then, what about their children? Would they ever be able to understand the truth behind their mother's tragic death and their father's actions? Could they ever reconcile the man they once loved with the one who destroyed their family? Could forgiveness ever be possible for them? Or would they forever live with the weight of knowing the truth of how everything went so horribly wrong? Finally, ask yourself, would you ever forgive someone if you found out they'd lied to you for years, even if it was for love? Would the love that came before the secret still be enough to hold on to? Or would the truth, no matter how painful, be the end of everything? If you haven't already, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Next time, we'll uncover another case where betrayal, secrets, and unimaginable decisions changed lives forever.